Welcome to our webinar. We're media.net. Today's webinar is Prevailing Over the Pandemic, How Publishers Can Adapt and Respond. Today, we're going to talk about how advertisers are responding and reacting to the global pandemic, from budgets to brand safety, and how are publishers then responding and impacting by these reactions. And finally, we're going to talk about trends that publishers can implement to build a more secure, financially strong future. Really quickly, I'd like to introduce you to my colleagues. Karan Dalal, SVP of Business Operations. Karan sits on both the buy and sell side. We have Jonathan Baraka, VP of Strategic Partnerships, and myself, Amy Ogawa, Director of Strategic Partnerships. Jonathan and I manage primarily the demand buy side here at media.net. We will also have time allocated at the end of our presentation for questions, so please feel free to submit any. There's the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. But let's get started. Really quickly, I'd like to just do a very high view of what advertisers are seeing in response to the global pandemic. They're seeing paused or reshuffled existing ad spend. The spend that's allocated or forecasted for 2020 is adjusted, and they're doing, from a brand safety perspective, a complete broad blocking of any sort of COVID-19 coronavirus content. So it's really, it's obviously there's a lot of impact that's happening with what's going on with the world. There's a lot of uncertainty, but the slowdown in digital is not quite as acute as what we're seeing in traditional advertising. So really quickly, I'd like to just share some adjusted forecasts that was shared by Magna Global. As you can see across every single channel, with the exception of digital media, there was a negative revised projection, upwards of negative 25%. Again, with the exception of digital media, which actually had an adjusted 4% increase. So there's a lot of shifts that's going on. These are things that we're seeing overall, very broadly on the advertiser side. But John, I'd like to start with you first, just for you to share a little bit of some surprising and interesting trends that you're seeing from the buy side.
Yep, thanks, Amy. And I think even before getting into stats and trends, it's important to take a step back and just think about how businesses in general are reacting to the pandemic, and then taking advertising and putting it on the side for a second and understanding how that fits into the priorities for each type of advertiser there is. Knowing that some advertising is extremely important to drive sales and conversions during this time, which may be a higher priority for some. And then other advertisers that may have more branding type of campaigns, which is maybe a little less urgent, and that money could be diverted into other areas to help business in general. So I think right now, businesses are essentially figuring out what are those priorities. First and foremost, are they able to run their business as is? Are they able to support, their employees and payroll and overhead costs? And then, what does that look like for the foreseeable future? Is that sustainable, not only now, but, 3, 6, 12, 18 months down the line, as a viable business model? So jumping into some of the trends specifically, eMarketer has released their U.S. digital ad spend growth. And overall, this year, they're projecting on the severe side for digital ad spend to be down 18% in the first half of 2020. And that's in comparison to digital ad spend being up 23% over the course of all of 2019. There's a few publicly traded companies that have reported similar results. So Rubicon have said that April revenue is down 30% year over year. Trade Desk also said something very similar, that April revenues are down year over year. Facebook and Google, who are typically a pretty good indicator for the overall health of advertising in general, had very similar statements. Facebook said something like it was a demand side shock in their recent earnings call, where average price per ad decreased by 16%. Google reported some of the lowest growth, display ad growth in their recent earnings call in recent memory. Overall, U.S. Open auction CPMs have also been down in anywhere in ranges between 15 and 30% since March 1st. So all of that said, that's very specific to a certain portion of advertising, not all advertising, but you can tell the weight that it carries and the impact that it's had across our ecosystem. So that presents a pretty interesting challenge, I would say, at the very least, to probably everybody in this room. Basically, we're at a point where overall ad spend has been pulled back, but at the same moment in time, overall web traffic has spiked. So more and more people are home; they're consuming more content across the web that's relevant to every bit of the crazy times that we're in now. A lot to do with coronavirus. And then at the very same time, advertisers are steering away budgets from coronavirus related content in general, and content creators and publishers have an increase in traffic, but not necessarily as much demand. So basically, trying to understand where there's pockets of performance, where the ad spend is coming in from, is the challenge that's created today. So with all that said, that kind of, the stats point to a very bleak picture, but it's not all bad. And there is positivity. So as far as, the types of budgets that are still available, that are, still consistent and even thriving, are performance-based budgets. So, typically what this is referring to and all those stats are referring to are traditional brand-based display buyers. But from a performance perspective, advertisers that are able to see a direct return on investment, able to clearly drive sales or conversions or some sort of, immediate outcome to direct response advertising, are seeing an increase and are continuing to spend money and actually increase money that they're spending in the overall ad ecosystem. E-marketer and advertiser perceptions that typically have a very good read on the buy side and advertiser ecosystem have both stated there likely won't be as large of a drop in pricing per search or performance-based buying. And that is actually going to continue and stay a constant throughout now and likely increase for the second half of 2020. So if you think about, real life scenarios and brands that this is relevant to, if you just think about kind of your day to day, there's companies like Peloton, for instance, where people are moving, all of their working out and fitness to at home. Peloton has increased their market cap by $5 billion since this pandemic started. And that's mainly, because they're driving awareness. They're spending advertising dollars to drive purchases for their service or their equipment in this case. Other companies, other examples, streaming services. Disney Plus has added, I think, 50 million new subscribers since the pandemic started in early March. And that's not by coincidence or surprise. More people are at home. They're advertising. They're spending money throughout the ecosystem, programmatic ecosystem, to try to drive signups. So any investment from an advertiser that drives any sort of direct response or immediate outcomes are valuable, and there's plenty of companies out there like that are continuing to not only provide a constant ad spend throughout this time, but also increased ad spend.
Absolutely. So we've talked a lot, just opening up our webinar about the buy side, but I'd love to hear from you, Karan. What is the impact? Like, what are you seeing from the sell side?
Sure. So thanks, Amy. So just like John was mentioning, I mean, there's different pockets of ad demand. When you're an advertiser, you're going to diversify, how you spend money to reach your users. You would spend some of your advertising revenue on display ads. You would spend some of it on Facebook, on Google, on search, on native, all of these different types of demand sources. And what happens because of that is, when you're confronted with any sort of pandemic or any sort of, marketplace changes, you're able to sort of direct your ad spend into mediums that work better for you versus others. And based off of that, I mean, at least what we're seeing, given that we've been a large partner of the Yahoo Bing partnership that kind of monetizes search, has been sort of spends changing and increasing in certain pockets, which actually cater to the market that we're in right now, with people staying at home, with people using certain services more than others. And in fact, as of May, as per the latest trend reports that we receive, as well as kind of what we're seeing in our marketplace, we're seeing erstwhile categories that that actually seen declines coming back. So if you see travel and lodging, which was one of the largest categories that was impacted, and autos, people were not driving to work or buying new cars, or all of that is sort of starting to make a comeback in May, which sort of suggests that overall the industry is expecting a lot of changes, with coronavirus being closer to being addressed, workplace sort of returning, markets opening. People are expecting spends to increase in some of these verticals. So I think, broadly, I think if you see the overall marketplace, while, like John mentioned, there is a decline in display spends over Q1 and parts of Q2. But that decline is not sort of proportionate across all formats of demand. There are certain demand formats that have sort of declined lesser compared to others, and certain pockets within each of these demands that have continued to either stay stable, seen increases, and we need to look at this on a more granular level to really see what's happening in the marketplace.
Yeah. And what are you seeing from your side in terms of, it's obviously really positive that we're seeing an uptick in consumer engagement, and that we're seeing really positive responses with some of these categories. What are you seeing, or what has the impact been from a CPM from that type of perspective for the sell side?
Sure. So from a broad CPM standpoint, like John again mentioned, we're seeing obviously about a 15 to 30% decline on the display side of things. But when you sort of combine that with some of the other formats of advertising that we tap into, search, for example, is a very important part of our sources of demand, and search represents about 50% of the global ad spend. So when you kind of factor in search, when you factor in native budgets, we do see sort of the decline being mitigated a little bit. I mean, there's definitely a decline. As you can see from this graph as well, search has probably seen the least decline from all the channels. The larger declines are primarily on sort of open web display and mobile display, because those were sort of top of the funnel branding budgets that most advertisers were utilizing, versus sort of search and social media, which are a little lower down the funnel, and you can reach your audiences better. So from our perspective as well, we've been able to kind of mitigate some of this decline with diving into these diversified ad spends. And so CPMs, on an aggregate level, have declined by about 10 to 15% for us, compared to people that are just reliant on display, which are significantly more.
Yeah, I agree. And I do agree that we had some really interesting stats as it pertains to the hit on display. And I think I'd like to shift a little bit of the conversation on that, on not only what is the impact from a brand safety, but what is it that publishers can do, and just the overall areas that for improvements. Really quickly,
Yeah,
I'd like, yeah.
I think bringing you into that conversation, I think, Amy, because you have the experience on the buy side, given the fact that there's a lot of decline that you see, which is brand specific, what are some of the trends that you're kind of seeing when you're talking to advertisers around brand safety?
Yeah, so obviously we're all consuming a lot of content, like John had mentioned. Obviously around COVID-19, coronavirus, and unfortunately a lot of that content is often associated with really grim, panic-inducing content that's also really politically aligned, which is all subjects that brands obviously do not feel comfortable, and they're very sensitive to that. But a recent Digiday survey stated that 40% of brands are not advertising at all next to coronavirus content online. And then the IAS actually stated that the term coronavirus was the second most blocked term after Trump for ad buys as early as 2020. And so this is really interesting. It is expected, obviously, because brand safety is always of utmost importance to advertisers. There is, I think, a lot of missed opportunity, because what we're seeing is that a lot of COVID content is actually really brand safe and could be a really good way for advertisers to hit a really engaged audience in a brand safe way.
Yeah. So, and I think like what you mentioned, Amy, there's a huge opportunity out there, and I think when this whole pandemic, the new normal that we're in started, there were a lot of knee-jerk reactions where maybe an axe was taken to brand
Yeah.
safety as an approach rather than a scalpel, which actually can be used very effectively with the use of the right types of ad technology specific to contextual or page level contextual. Media.net, we did a study and we looked at 45 billion ad impressions that appeared anywhere that appeared in content that had some level of reference to either coronavirus or COVID or the pandemic or anything at all that mentioned it. So in a keyword-based approach, that would all be bad, right? But looking at that on a more granular level with page level contextual data, we were able to understand that 72% of that 45 billion impressions that were related to COVID content were actually safe. And what does safe actually mean? That means, parenting or figuring out how to homeschool your kids during coronavirus, or what to binge watch on Netflix while stuck home on the lockdown, or what cooking recipes can I come up with this weekend while stuck in the house with coronavirus lockdown happening. So those are all examples of very safe content, content that brands would have no problem being next to in any other state of kind of where we're at. But because of the keyword being there, these were actually being blocked by a lot of advertisers, even ones that we've personally spoken with.
Yeah.
There's a smaller percentage, which I think is what brands were initially concerned about with all of this coming out, and that 28%, the minority of the 45 billion impressions that we looked at, did have a more sensitive coronavirus content around it. So I would say that's things like tragic content and fatality rates, and really the sad news that you can totally understand brands feeling uncomfortable being next to. But I think at that point, brands probably weren't looking at all of the tools that they had at their disposal to do this with a more nuanced approach. And the other thing that's important to understand here as well is that this content isn't going anywhere. More and more coronavirus referenced content is being created and will be for the foreseeable future. So brands need to really look to their partners and understand how they can take this nuanced approach to understanding the good, or separating out the good versus the bad, and then also inform their messaging, their strategy, their approach to advertising and creating a relevant advertising experience to those users and what they're reading about. So context is key, and I would just one more thing to throw out there. This isn't anything that new. Coronavirus is definitely new. COVID-19 is definitely new. But as far as like the approach to brand safety, there's always been unsafe news, but maybe brands would block all news, but not all news is bad. There's political news, there's controversial news, and all of that can be really separated if advertisers have the right ad tech partners, and then publishers alike are surfacing the most relevant and transparent components or at least content of their site. And Karan, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add on the publisher side specifically, but aligning that buy side and sell side strategy can really create a lot of opportunities for advertising dollars to flow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a quick note there. And this is from sort of anecdotal conversations we've had with a few publishers that we work with. A lot of times when you're a large news publisher, for example, a lot of your content has been tagged based on what your editorial teams believe is the right way of categorizing your content. A lot of times, they don't factor in advertising as a completely different way of categorizing content. And we've sort of seen differences in performance when you're able to surface categorization that is more specific to an advertising context versus an editorial context. So to give you an example, most likely most editorial teams would categorize COVID content or coronavirus content as coronavirus. But if you sort of dig deeper into categorizing it into some of the verticals that John mentioned, where you separate out, parenting coronavirus content, which would be brand safe from an advertiser standpoint. And you could do that, yourself. You could, work with partners to do that. And those can be surfaced to advertisers, or you could have some of your direct advertisers also buy against that. That would definitely mitigate some of the decline that you're seeing overall when advertisers are buying your inventory.
Yeah. Great
Yeah,
advice.
and there's real-time application to this too, right? So, giving advertisers, if this is surfaced correctly, advertisers can easily target this safe content through a deal ID or some sort of more granular approach than buying in the open auction. This could easily be surfaced to brands. We've seen it happen, across our marketplace as well. So I think there is an appetite, and partners have leaned on quality ad tech partners to help them navigate through this time, and also I think there is a need, or at least the want to fund content and news publishers. That's the other important part of this. When there's a blunt blocking approach to something this big, that takes up so much of the content that we're all reading about today, that's relevant to the user experience and everything that we read on an everyday, regular people read on an everyday level. But if you're not advertising there, you're not able to fund those premium quality publishers and all publishers that are creating, this content. So I think that's the other side of it, where it's just, connecting the pipes in a very clean and transparent way to enable advertising activity to resume how we think it should.
Yeah. I'd like to dig a little bit deeper on that, especially with so many sell side partners online. Karan, I'd like you to, we talked about brand safety, but can you dig a little bit deeper on what publishers can do to really navigate through these challenges, not just short term, but long term as well?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of different things that we touched upon through this presentation. But I would sort of distill that to 3 or 4 broad things. The first one sort of that we talked about briefly was how you could diversify the ads that you tap into, right? So most publishers generally rely on display. Some of them have few other formats like content recommendation widgets, or the like that they would tap into. But a lot of people don't look at native as a demand source. They don't look at search as a demand source. Now, search is typically always looked at as a search box, but there are companies like us and others that would allow you to be able to tap into search budgets within a display placement in a unique format. You would not probably have looked at video. So there's all of these different ad spends that you should probably look at, and all of them should sort of be brought into the mix so that you could balance out your dependencies. So when there's any sort of decline in one sort of spend, you will have some of the other spends to compensate for that.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the first one. And then, I think that the other one is just tapping into different integrations, right? And I think, Amy, we wanted to kind of quickly run a poll to see, how many of you guys actually use header bidding, which is sort of a format that originated a couple of years ago. But, we still see a large percentage of people that don't necessarily use header bidding or don't use all the forms of programmatic bidding that exist in the open market. So if you guys want to spend like a minute and quickly provide your responses to this. That would help us sort of cater our conversation according to that. I'll give you guys a minute to respond. So do we have the results?
We'll just have our moderator share the results, please.
So while we're just waiting on that, I think the goal for us was to sort of see how many people run programmatic advertising at all. And there's a few different options, like we mentioned. There's pre-bid, and there's other sort of header bidding platforms. There's Google that offers open bidding. And like we had discussed and predicted when we started this conversation, the poll results are out. And we see about 45% of the people that have said that they don't run any programmatic advertising. And that's an important sort of part of the way the market is evolving now, where people are sort of advertisers are choosing to transact programmatically. And if you're not tapping into that format, you're basically losing out on a large percentage of the spend and how that is being transacted. So there's a few different options available in the market, to be able to tap into this. There's a lot of managed services offerings as well, to help you and guide you through some of these integrations. Like I said, Google offers its own as well in a product they call Open Bidding. So that's sort of the second way that you could help mitigate some of the declines, by tapping into new spend types, tapping into new integrations and formats of advertising. And the third thing is broadly just yield management, right? So when you tap into these different ad formats, you obviously need to balance all of them out. One should not impact the other. You want to keep trying and tweaking that strategy over a couple of weeks, months, testing different options to make sure that you're sort of maximizing each format and its use cases. So for example, when you're tapping into native budgets, native is a very performance-driven advertising type. So if you place those ad formats in the footer of a page, you're not really going to be able to drive any yield. So you want to place that in pages that have engagement. So there's a couple of different things that you need to mix and match to make sure that you guys are going to tap into all of these spends adequately. And the other one, I think, John, if you want to try and kind of jump in there, is just content consumption, right? And the trends that you're seeing there.
I think really there's certain verticals that can help inform your content strategy during these fluctuations that we're seeing throughout the pandemic. There's certain types of categories outside of the separating safe and unsafe, but what of the safe, what type of verticals are being looked at from an advertising perspective to be valuable and relevant, and what's not. So I think anything that can be considered like an out and about type of vertical. So think about restaurants or tourism or traditional brick and mortar retail, autos. Those are types of content. If you're talking about specifically that type of content, which is being a little less consumed, I would say, at this point. And it's really shifting towards the more hunker down at home type content. When you think about direct to consumer goods, CPG, food, which is a necessity, right, for everybody. Online retail, gaming, health, alcohol, food and drinks. These are all things that people are reading about. And really, if you use this and understand that brands are actually actively spending money and opening up spend to these different types of categories that are actually more relevant, if you use that to inform your content strategy, it could potentially open up, the flow of brand dollars into your site. So I think it's not necessarily that complicated from a content story perspective. Anything that could be considered unsafe or sensitive is typically going to be steered away from, pandemic or not. And then anything that is safe, it can be essentially catered to be more relevant to the way advertisers are spending today. And this is more specifically to performance advertising as we were talking about it now, and not even really considering, the brand budgets will start to come back. And there's eMarketer and all of these studies are talking about brand budgets starting to increase already. But really do see it, nobody knows for sure at what point everything will change. But over time, we do expect, the branding and US display ad side to start picking back up again.
Good to see. Great.
Yes.
So I think we do have some time for questions at this point. Are you guys able to view the submitted questions? I just want to make sure that we have enough time to cover anything that our participants might be curious to learn about as well.
Yep, I think there's some interesting questions that we received, and I think we can split it between us and answer some of that. I'm just going to go through the list as we have it. Amy and John, if you guys. So I think the first one was around why sort of media.net has a contextual ads offering versus a display ads offering, given that display ads are more viewable than contextual ads. I can take that. So like we mentioned, we don't only offer a contextual ads product. We actually believe in creating auction pressure with all forms of advertising competing for inventory, which results in sort of higher yields for publishers, which results in sort of any mitigation in declines, when those happen with tapping into these different formats like we've discussed. So it's not one or the other. We offer display ads, we offer contextual ads, which are driven by sort of search spends. We have native ads, we have video ads, we have kind of ads across the ecosystem. And you need to sort of tap into all of them and balance, each one out like we've discussed. I'll jump into the next one if you guys want to take that, Amy or John, around recent advertising spend behavior.
Yeah, I think, and there was another question around CPMs as well. So I think, right, Karan mentioned it. We work with all types of advertisers, some of the biggest ad agencies and holding companies globally, so the largest ad platforms that facilitate those spends, and it's both branding and performance. So I would say, while some verticals have dropped off, you can think about verticals like the airline industry, right? They would typically spend a lot of money in advertising, but that has since been pulled back, and that's one that we'll look to see come back over the future, as we mentioned before. But a lot of those performance-based budgets, the ones that show real return on ad investment, are the ones that are getting prioritized by these advertisers. So how that's affected CPMs. We hit on this a little bit earlier, but I think the more performance-based advertising spend likely is going to win more, but at lesser CPMs. But the what happens there is when they are winning more and advertisers are able to find performance, especially within less competition that's happening, they're able to essentially direct more budgets into that buying. So while the CPMs might be down, overall performance-based budgets and spending is going up. So that's where the balance is that we're seeing, and talk about diversified, demand sources. Performance is a constant and potential increase in ad spend, while branding is down, and that's where you're seeing the fluctuations in CPM.
Yep, and I think specifically, someone had asked a question around the education space. That's definitely a vertical which is very performance driven. There's definitely a lot of brand budgets that are out there for education, but performance is a big part of education is probably one of the largest search advertising spaces, because a lot of online universities are looking to drive leads for their programs. And we actually have seen a pretty large uptick in education as a whole, both from direct advertisers as well as kind of partners that we work with on the search side as well as in native side. So education is definitely a big market. CPMs are on the uptick, even through this pandemic. And that's definitely a more interesting space as things progress with all the things that are going to possibly change as a result of this pandemic.
Definitely.
I think someone had a question on how we categorize content. Amy, John, do you guys want to talk about it from the demand standpoint?
Yeah, I think the really important kind of takeaways here are categorizing content historically, and what brands have been doing, which led to this like knee-jerk reaction of blocking all coronavirus-based content, was due to keyword-based contextual, which essentially looks at words on a page, and if it finds a word that brands either want to exclude, essentially that entire page would be ineligible for ad spend to make it through. So contextual in from our standpoint is not just a keyword based approach, but it's understanding full page context, everything that's happening on the page within the content, phrases of that content, titles, descriptions, tone, sentiment, everything that has to do with what's going on within the full page, to understand not just coronavirus or COVID or anything in general, but what is the theme of that page? What's it actually discussing? Is it discussing one of those safe topics around, parenting during coronavirus, or is it tragic or unsafe? Having a contextual partner that can get very granular on a page level, not just a site or domain level, is very important. And that's the type of tools that will ultimately help buyers and agencies navigate through the separation of good versus bad content. And again, this has application well outside of coronavirus and the pandemic. It's very relevant now, but I'd say for all types of publishers that produce, very various and diversified content, especially in the news vertical, this is more important than ever to make sure that your contextual partner does all of these things and asking the right questions.
I guess we have a few questions that we can combine around the search advertising piece and how that could be made available as well. So the search advertising CPMs sort of vary by vertical and the type of content. So, because given that their performance budgets, they're all driven by engagement and how the advertisers are sort of reacting to your user base. So it is available through a regular standard pre-bid adapter. For example, if you have pre-bid as your header bidding wrapper, media.net has a pre-bid adapter. You can tap into both search and display and native budgets through the same sort of adapter. We have our own platform as well, which allows you to tap into this and sort of like pre-bid, work with multiple partners. So yeah, from a CPM standpoint, they're sometimes better, sometimes comparable, and it all changes based on the verticals that you guys are writing content in. From a budget allocation standpoint, it's again really hard to say what the percentage is across display, search, native. It all depends on the content you're writing, the kind of users. The interesting thing is that it's all run through an auction. So everybody gets to compete on price, and whoever pays the highest gets that impression. So you could have specific placements on your site dedicated to only search or only native as well, but you could also have standard display placements that have all of these formats competing in one auction, and the percentages will be based on whoever pays the highest price. I think those were most of the questions. Just going to run down the list. I don't know, John, Amy, do you guys have?
Yeah, I think we got most of them. There was something in here about video ads, display ads, and options within media.net. So, just to address, we support all formats across all different advertising types. So that is available. And also just to kind of go a step further into what we were discussing before, not all ad budgets have stopped. So there still is typical branding and display based budgets happening. They may be at a slower pace than they were prior, but there is still ads flowing on both channels, whether it's performance or branding. And likely the branding parts have picked back up, but it hasn't. Some advertisers have pulled back completely, but a lot are still spending just in various, reforecasted types of budgets.
Great. Were there any other additional questions?
I think there was one around drop in consumer engagement due to COVID-19. Um, we've actually seen an uptick in consumer engagement post COVID-19. I think there's a lot more consumer engagement on certain types of articles. People are definitely spending more time on the internet. So there's definitely sort of supply volumes overall have increased. So from that perspective, there's an increase. Obviously, from an advertising standpoint, the demand is going into places that are brand safe, like we've discussed, that are in verticals that are actually spending. So as long as you're sort of tapping into all of those, you should see sort of an uptick in consumer engagement and advertising engagement.
Yeah. And I know we covered a lot of content today and a lot of data. So we definitely will be sharing all of this following the webinar. So definitely feel free, if you guys have additional questions following up, to email us. I think this concludes our webinar in terms of timing right now. But just wanted to thank everyone. I know it's really quite a crazy time in the world, and I'm sure in all of your homes. And we really do appreciate you guys taking the time to connect with us today. We hope this was really helpful, and we will be sending follow-ups. But thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, and stay safe.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Yep.
Bye.